William, before we start this episode, I just have one question for you. So if you could come to my microphone for 1 second, please. Please.
Da, 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 da.
You know when we say that the food you leave on your plate, you're wasting food and it's contributing to climate change, and everybody assumes that we understand what we're talking about. Do we really understand what we're talking about?
No.
When you leave food on your plate,
Yes.
or when you buy a bunch of bananas and then it's in your home and then it gets rotten and then it's, you throw it away, what are you thinking?
I think of, when they do decompose, they just give me manure and microbes grow away. That's what I think.
Great. Thanks, William. Thank you for setting the stage for our conversation today. This is Climate Talk Uganda. My name is Josephine Karunji. In today's episode, we're getting into what has been described as one of the biggest hidden contributors to climate change, food wastage. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, about 1/3 of all food produced globally never reaches the consumer's table. Joining me is Rierson, former head of the Center for Post-Harvest Reduction based in Uganda, presently runs Harvest Agriculture Solutions. Brett is an expert in how food waste contributes to climate change. Brett, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Paint a picture for me in a very simple way. This statement on 1/3 of all food produced never reaching the consumer's table. What are they saying?
I think it's useful to take a broader look and then go down to actually the farm or the table, because they really are two different aspects of it. If you were to look at food waste and loss on a global level as a country in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, something like 4.4 gigatons of CO2 per year, that would be the third largest country in the world, trailing only China and the United States. It's absolutely massive, the impact that it has, but it goes largely unnoticed because of the very, very complex and distributed nature of our food systems.
So like William said at the beginning of this podcast, when we have rotten bananas or whatever it is in our homes, what we see is manure.
Mm-hmm.
But we're constantly told, or we hear that, food wastage, climate change. Explain that to me.
I think that's where you need to carve it up into the markets that are, let's say, Europe and the United States or China. China is a big one. Or markets like Uganda, where, and again, Uganda is a cornucopia of agricultural production. Just amazing production here, amazing capabilities of the farmers. But you have very different types of food waste and loss in a more developed market where it's much more in the distribution and end consumer compared to here where most of it is in Uganda or Kenya or Ethiopia. Much of it is in the production and then in post-harvest losses. The 1/3 number that was given by FAO, this was a number that was developed about 15 years ago in Rome by two very talented researchers, and they took very inexact data from very many different countries with no real standard measure or method of measurement. When we were doing work all across Uganda and dealing specifically with grains, not even fruits and vegetables, which is much higher, but the loss levels for grains, didn't matter if it was sorghum or rice or maize, were all at or about 40%. So much, much higher than the levels that FAO had very conservatively estimated. Much higher. I mean, the dollar figures for this, I don't know what it is today for Uganda, but when FAO and the United Nations Environment Program, FAO is Food and Agricultural Organization, as we're in the acronym-free zone.
Acronym-free zone.
But they estimated close to $1 trillion a year of losses. So that's just the financial side. But if you look at what happens in terms of even fertilizer made from petroleum with the Haber-Bosch process, the fertilizer itself, the methane that's given off the fruits and vegetables that your earlier guests had talked about, the transport to and from markets, because in many cases we've seen, especially grain farmers, have to transport it both ways if they don't sell it the first day because there's no safe stores for it. We just saw huge losses that were vastly underestimated, and when you empirically measured them, minimum 40%.
Explain it to me like I'm a child. How does food wastage relate to climate change?
The process of growing, then the process of bringing the food to the market, the gasoline that's used, the petroleum products that are used, and then the actual wastage and the release of methane from especially fruits and vegetables. Those are kind of the three big chunks: the production, the distribution, and then the actual wastage itself. All of those are using either chemicals or using a process. And when I say a process, how do you get to market? You put it on a truck. That truck uses gasoline. If that food gets there and is not consumed by humans, or again, William I was glad to hear that you're doing the composting, because at least it can go back in and have some type of a positive impact. But if it's just there rotting, then you have even bigger problems. And then in Uganda as well, you had, it's not so specifically a climate change problem, but you had the problems of aflatoxins in grains. Again, vastly underestimated, totally shut down the trade with Kenya a couple of years ago. And it's just, again, these things have massive impacts across the Sustainable Development Goals, not only climate, but climate is, as I say, kind of the big hidden one that no one seems to think about.
When you're thinking about wastage, how bad is it for Uganda specifically?
Well, again, Uganda was, for grains, it was in excess of 40% across the board. And I think the estimates that MAFE had, the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, they had losses, they were estimating somewhere between 10 to 20%. And they were minimum of double that, and consistently across all regions. In terms of shillings lost per year, I really don't know what the current level is, but we saw when I was working with the World Food Program, I know that we had reached, I think it was 160,000 farming families that chose to use some very simple technology to reduce their post-harvest losses, hermetic bags, literally an airtight bag. And those losses went from 40% to somewhere around 2% on average. So very inexpensive solutions are available. And again, your earlier guests, at the consumer level or at the farmer level, there are some good answers out there, but just doesn't seem to be getting to the market.
What are the biggest drivers of this loss?
For grains, I'll divide it into two: grains and then the produce. For grains, the post-harvest losses are a lack of adequate storage or good storage. And again, these hermetic or airtight bags, which were, to the farmer, I think they were about 7,000 shillings to store 100 kilos. And you could use that bag 4 times. So let's say 2,000 shillings for harvest, 2,000 shillings per harvest per 100 kilos. And that would reduce your losses from that 40% down to 2%. So that was, or that continues to be, and AgroZ is one company, Grain Pro is another company. There's so many good products out there, but people are just not using them or not aware of them. But the biggest piece with the farmer was that then they could control their time of sale. instead of selling when everyone else sells and then having to buy grain back from the traders. That alone made such a massive impact. Farming family by farming family by farming family, they could afford school fees for their kids. They could afford medical care. They had enough food during the lean season. And again, 2,000 shillings for a 100-kilo bag. And we can put some links in the show notes if people are interested in how to access these products. Yeah. So that's grain. If you look at produce, fruits, and vegetables, loss levels were much higher than that. 40% for grain. We're looking 50, 60, sometimes even higher than that for most forms of produce, be it fruits or vegetables. And so that the solutions, there was a program that was run, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, started by the Rockefeller Foundation called YieldWise. And they worked with mango farmers in Kenya. They worked with tomato farmers in Nigeria. We were part of the experiments with grain, and there were great solutions out there, but just very, very little notice in the public mind or in the farming mind or the consumer's mind to actually make a difference.
I was watching something from a program, a little clip from many years ago about Uganda, and though they said something that we still say till now, that you can just throw something anywhere in Uganda and it will grow.
Yep.
So we have so much production. Mm-hmm. How is that contributing to waste? Is that a problem?
Well, I don't think it's the production. There's certainly not, I wouldn't consider an overproduction. Uganda has the opportunity to become the breadbasket for East Africa at a minimum, if not others. If you look at Uganda has, I think, something like 5 out of 6 harvests are successful in Uganda. Less than half of the harvests are considered successful in Kenya. Kenya has a massive demand for fruits, vegetables, as well as for grains. Sudan, same thing. There's such a demand for Ugandan products, and the ability to safely store and ship. Simple solutions. Again, I mentioned YieldWise from Rockefeller before. Even collapsible crates that were able to cushion or more easily get tomatoes to market. Or having a secondary, what do you do with tomatoes that are off? And I think it was actually in a collaboration with Dangote, the massive companies, the billionaire in Nigeria, where they were trying to make, how can you do secondary products with the tomatoes that can't be purchased by the consumers? So there's just great opportunity. And my focus was mainly on the grain side and the ability of Ugandan farmers. And again, it's a very disaggregated industry at present. I think it's something like 80% of the members of the Grain Council of Uganda, they don't actually grow their own crops. They aggregate. So it's actually against their interest that the farmers have more power. And the ability of the farmers to actually control their time of sale would undercut the business of these big agricultural traders. And so they're actually not interested in reducing the loss level because it would that might be stepping a little too far. I'm sure they're interested in reducing loss levels, but not if it compromises their business model.
Thinking policies, thinking strategy, what should we be thinking about agriculture in Uganda?
The biggest potential, and I do not say it is low-hanging fruit. I don't believe in that phrase. There's no low-hanging fruit. All of this is hard work. But the biggest potential is the reduction of post-harvest losses in grains by far. And that has a cascade impact across the Sustainable Development Goals. That has a massive impact on women's empowerment. We saw it have an impact on the health of children because there was a a reduction in aflatoxin levels. We saw children's schooling because they were more able to attend school. They weren't out looking for food for their families, or they weren't sick from the aflatoxins. The climate impact, the hunger impact, water use impact. There's just an absolutely massive impact across these SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. And again, at a very low price point. This is not, and my business, I do not sell any of these products, so I'm not.
There's no vested interest.
There's no vested interest here, but it just amazes me that this has not been more of a priority for the government, for the Ministry of Health in terms of aflatoxins, for the Ministry of Trade in terms of cross-border trade, for the Ministry of East African Community Affairs. These very simple, low-cost, low-tech solutions have been available since I showed up in Uganda 10 years ago, and they're still relatively unknown. It's frustrating.
A very random question, Brett. Has there been a food loss that you've seen that stuck with you?
Oh, absolutely. And I can think of multiple occasions. I remember once in Ngulu going to see the actual traditional storage, where the moment that you open it up, the weevils are just everywhere. The rats are everywhere. And all of this very, very preventable. Another time I would say that comes to mind was the company Grain Pro had a bag opening ceremony, and this was in Karamoja. And they had the traditional storage units, and then next to it, but again, sheltered from the sun, sheltered from the elements, but hermetic bags. And you open up the hermetic bags after 6 months, and it is pristine grain. Pristine, just absolutely clean, pure grain. And then you open up the traditional storage. We had done it at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months, and there's almost nothing left to eat. Nothing at all. The longest, actually, that we've seen preservation of grain was actually in Rwanda, and there was a project, again, this company, Grain Pro, they had a project with the Rwandan government, and they put in cowpeas and maize. And cowpeas are even more fragile than other grains. And change in government, change in officials, change in personnel, it was forgotten. And they found it 12 years later. And again, we can put a link to this in the show notes. And there's a great YouTube video, 12 years in a cocoon. And they opened up the cocoon after 12 years. The cowpeas, the maize was in pristine condition, almost no loss. And interestingly enough, the grain, you could still germinate the grain. There was no lack of fecundity in terms of the grain itself being replanted, even 12 years later, which is crazy. I mean, people are losing, the grain farmers here after 4 or 5 months, if it's in their traditional stores, if they have any left, it's been totally compromised, mainly by insects, rats, and mold. Whereas here's 12 years. I mean, that's inconceivable.
Are there, from the consumer side, right, are there any tips you'd give to say, listen, this is the cost of food loss, and this is what we need to start doing?
I think that's much more on the fruits and vegetable side. Consumers at any income level could conserve their grain relatively easily. And I don't think there's a huge amount of need for new technologies to come in to save the day. The technology's already there. These hermetic bags that I'm talking about could also easily be used in your kitchen. Farmers that use these or consumers that use these, you need to keep the grain in the bag for in reality, it's about 2.5 weeks, but we would tell the farmers 4 weeks just to make it consistent. There's no Lazarus effect. The insects don't come back. If you leave it open and the insects land in it again, yes, then they send off their pheromone trails and all their friends come for a free lunch. But if you have grain that's safely stored in your kitchen in a hermetic bag, and then you take it out, daily basis even, and you reseal it, then you can yourself reduce losses at home. And I think that the new products, Garden Fresh and
Fresa Nanotech.
Fresa Nanotech. I think again the Fresa Nanotech, the tea bag idea, the ease of use of that, and just having it sitting in your basket with your Indizi bananas or whatever you're buying. I think that ease of use actually has huge potential. And I think the consumers can easily see what's in it for them in terms of reducing the loss, reducing the financial expenditure. And it's never enough Indizi bananas for me.
Thank you very much, Brett.